Good day, students. Again, this is Mr. Mark Joseph Bibadillo, and you can call me Mr. MJ, and welcome back to this subject, disaster readiness and risk reduction. By the way, students, this is our first discussion in this subject. For this day, we are going to discuss lesson 1.1 about the concept of disaster. But before we proceed in our entire discussion, let me let me present to you our essential learning competencies that will serve as our objectives for today's discussion. So first is we are going to explain disaster, and also we are going to differentiate risk factors underlying disasters. Let me ask you a question. What does a hazard become a disaster? This question is very interesting if we are going to talk about the concept of disaster. Do you have any idea about the meaning of disaster? You will know the answer for this question in today's discussion. What do you mean by disaster? Disaster are defined by the United Nations of Office for Disaster Reduction or UNISDR, is a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or society involving widespread human, material, economic, or environmental losses and impacts which exceeds the ability of the affected community or society to cope using its own resources. Meaning, oftentimes disasters are associated with large-scale destructive events such as typhoons, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions, among others. Although these events occur on all over the world, some communities have ways of reducing the impact of hazards so that they do not turn into disasters. For some people, disaster may also be viewed as the struggles and challenges they face in getting their lives back to normal. They may have problems in rebuilding their homes, restarting their livelihood, or in dealing with the loss of loved ones, specifically or especially when there is no immediate response from the government or local authority. The Philippines' geographic and geological setting contributes to the reasons why these hazards can be disastrous. When communities are situated in places where they cannot protect themselves with the resources they have, or they become vulnerable. There are many factors that contribute to the vulnerability of a community. First is the poverty. For example, it limits the option on where to settle. Oftentimes, houses are built wherever there is an open space, completely neglecting the dangers that they will be exposed to. And also, education plays a big part in the vulnerability of a community. If a community can never be disaster resilient, if it does not understand the basic knowledge of disasters and also disaster risk reduction, certain global issues such as climate change also has an impact. Studies have shown that climate change affects sea levels and the strength and frequency of typhoons. This, in turn, makes coastal communities even more susceptible to storm surges, tsunamis, and flash floods. Human-induced environmental changes such as urbanization could also increase the vulnerability of existing communities. The concept of disaster is a serious problem occurring over a short or long period of time that causes widespread of human, material, economic, or environmental loss, which exceeds the ability of the affected community or society to cope using its own resources. So that is the meaning of disaster. In the Philippines, The effects brought about by the disastrous typhoon Haiyan, locally called as Yolanda, can still be felt in Tacloban years after the disaster happened. With more than 6,000 people dead and a lot of infrastructure and houses damaged, the effect of a disaster can be really overwhelming. But the increase in the number of typhoons that hit in the Philippines also inhibits the country's capability for recovery because of dealing with disastrous events. These events, whether natural or human made, also occur in other parts of the world. A disaster is a sudden, calamitous event, usually catching residents unprepared. During Super Typhoon Yolanda, the local government and residents of Tacloban were prepared for a typhoon, but were off caught off guard rather by the sudden flood caused by the storm surge. A disaster disrupts the functions of community and causes property, economic and environmental losses, or even loss of lives. Although most often caused by natural hazards, disasters can also be human-made, brought about by poor planning. Another example of human-made hazard is improper land use of zoning, such as presence of an industrial facility in a densely populated residential area. An example is the Pandacan Petroleum Depot in Manila. A leak in the tank could lead to a widespread fire or spread toxic fumes in the air that could immediately affect nearby residents. Simply put, a disaster occurs when a hazard happens and creates an impact to people or communities which are vulnerable rather. Thus, disaster is the result of the combination of hazards, exposure, vulnerability, and risk. That's the lesson for today. Thank you for listening. Again, this is Mr. Mark Joseph B. Badillo. For your clarifications, you can ask me directly or even you can comment down below. Thank you and God bless you all. Stay safe.